presentation is all yours.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. I'll begin. So good morning. Thank you for joining us here very early on a Sunday morning. We appreciate it. My name is Kevin. This is my colleague, Matthew. We're both lecturers at Kondo University over in Chiba. And the title of our presentation this morning is Exploratory Practice in an L2 genre writing class. The outline of our presentation here, we want to start with connection to the conference themes, talk about the goal of this presentation, what we want to do this morning, and then our project. We wrote a literature review to frame it. I'll go over that section. Matthew will talk about the project, the course, and the methodology, points 4, 5, and 6. I'll talk about the results and analysis, how we looked at our data. And then Matthew will talk about discussion and conclusions, kind of future directions. So we want to introduce the project, where we're coming from, what is exploratory practice. By the end of it, we'll have some time, hopefully, for any questions, and then that'll be it. So making the connection first, when we looked at this conference, we focused on this point, how does language learning connect the inside and the outside of the learner, the classroom, and society? We were looking at this topic of EP, exploratory practice, and I'll explain more about the theory. The essence of it, the takeaway of it, is that teachers and learners are research collaborators. Students are not participants, but rather collaborators. They take part in the research process. And they do so by designing their own language learning puzzles. And the focus of EP is on classroom quality of life. So in this presentation, we want to discuss the background of exploratory practice. People might be familiar with it. It might be a new term. We just want to give an idea of where we're coming from with it. And we want to analyze how it was implemented in Matthew's course. Matthew was the teacher of this reading and writing course. I was the co-researcher kind of on the back end. And then we want to end with some reflections and suggestions of the potential role, if people are interested in this idea, how it might look in your own classroom, and some of the advantages and drawbacks of doing it. So to get into that, I'll start with literature review. Action research. This is probably a term people are more familiar with. There's a quote here from Professor Ann Burns, a self-reflective, systematic, and critical approach to inquiry by participants who are at the same time members of the research community, meaning that teachers analyze their own classroom practices for critically informed changes. This is the well-understood idea of action research, that you're doing the research within your own pedagogical practice. It's part of what you're doing in the classroom. Exploratory practice takes that kind of a step further, or maybe a kind of a development of that. So it builds from action research, but it's less technicist. By that, it means we're exploring puzzles instead of solving a problem. So it considers teachers, well, I'll hold off on that, but puzzles versus problems. If you think of a research project, it kind of asks this question: why is this happening? How does this happen? And it might frame questions as problems to be solved. Exploratory practice would like to say, why don't you just look at the quality of life of the room and let the puzzles themselves emerge from that? And you might not find the answer, but you're going to explore and understand the situation better. And this approach is meant to consider teachers without time or resources for traditional research models, something that a lot of teachers run into, particularly early in their career, as myself and Matthew are. You might find a lot of demands on your time. And it's meant to use normal pedagogic practices as investigative tools. And this is coming from the author Allwright, who writes a lot about exploratory practice. And it involves students as co-researchers who benefit equally with teachers, including professional development. So it's not only the teacher investigating something, but the students as well. This is a common visualization of action research. And you can see you start with a plan, you move into an action, observe the results, reflect on what happened, and that helps to revise your plan. So this cycle is a continual thing. We found this quite helpful while we were designing our project, but we wanted to move a bit further from that. So exploratory practice, it works in a similar way as above, but it seeks to understand experiences versus fixing problems. And it also involves students as classroom researchers. I know I'm saying that again and again, but I hope in the methods it becomes clear what we mean by that. EP, part of the appeal, it appeals to teachers who might have pressure to both teach and contribute to academic literature. This is something that a lot of us feel, that teacher researcher praxis on how do you balance these things. A lot of us have time and resource limits. We might have full teaching loads. And in some cases, there might be few external motivators for instructors. You know, sometimes school support or university support is not always there. You know, what conferences do I go to? What journals do I publish in? How do I know these things? How do I figure these things out? EP can be a way to make you think of yourself differently as a researcher in your normal practice already. The fourth point there, possible theory and practice disconnect. I have often read many articles with very, very good theories, interesting theories, compelling. Monday morning in the classroom, it's very hard for me to see how it connects. It's very hard for me to bring that into that classroom and say, okay, we're going to do this, because the theory came from a different context, a different time, a different place. And when I'm talking about my localized students, my local context, it might feel like a disconnect there. And then finally, there might be a lack of confidence or training with conducting research. I've felt this quite often, the infamous imposter syndrome, that you spend a lot of time working on becoming a teacher and your identity as a teacher, and then suddenly you're feeling, oh, I have to do research now. Well, that's a whole different set of skills, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. So EP is meant to bring those worlds closer together and help teachers reimagine themselves as teacher researchers. So encouraging teacher practitioners, investigating classroom quality of life, responding directly to local teacher-student needs, merging that practice, as I said just a little earlier, using what you're already doing, increasing motivation for both the teacher and the students because you're collaborating. Oh, sorry, yeah, that's all right. So increasing both of that. And for the students, on the student side of things, encouraging them as stakeholders. This quote comes from Hanks, one of the case studies we looked at in our literature review. She writes that EP is directly relevant to student needs and teacher perceptions of those needs. So she found it was directly connected rather than being disconnected or theoretical. And it's meant to bridge cultural and situational gaps between students and teachers, which can be a big issue in a lot of TESOL or second language practice. It reimagines the classroom as a social community versus a learning space. Because the students are involved in course design, course curriculum, there's a little bit more ownership or stakeholder mentality in what happens in that space. And of course, it's meant to be responsive to the student needs first and foremost. It repositions the teacher, and this is a challenge that Matthew will talk about later. It repositions the teacher as a collaborator rather than an authority figure. This might sound like a simple thing, or we might think, well, I already do that. But it's actually quite a shift when you're actually in the process of doing it. The first case study we looked at was Hanks. What I want to highlight in the case studies is that EP looks different in different places. That's one of the principles of it, because it's contextualized. So in the first case study, Hanks was working EAP course in a UK university, and she used EP as the content, meaning the students learned academic English by investigating their own language learning inquiries. Something like, why can't I do this? How do I do that? Why do I have trouble with this? And those questions became, I see, sorry, chat question. I got a little distracted. The questions became the content by which students investigated and learned those skills. And as a second point in Hanks's study, the course teachers themselves also participated with their own language teaching puzzles. So the teachers were asking, how can I do this better? What am I doing here? And so on. The second case study Pinter and Associates, 2016, these were English classes for children in India, very different context, sort of elementary, junior high school. And the classes adopted varying degrees of EP. This was a much larger study with many different kinds of classes. So they had some students assisting directly in course development. So students were asking about better ways of drilling for a grammar test, whereas other students researched their own puzzles. So rather than course design, they just looked at how they themselves were learning, asking questions like, why don't students finish homework on time? So what we want to show with the case studies here is that EP is looking very differently based on where you're doing it and what the interests of the students are. I'm going to hand it off to Matthew now to go into the project to show you what we did in our case here in Japan.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. And as for some of the chat questions coming in, I hope some of your questions are answered as we go through the project, especially this last question about how Japanese students responded to that shift in authority figure. I think you'll find some positive reactions from our students. In terms of this project, when we conducted this project, we first, as we're doing in this presentation, defined exploratory practice, kind of a practitioner research that branched off of action research. We will explain how we implemented it into a first-year program at our university. And we'd like to share the results of the project. So we were able to contextualize genre writing. If you're unfamiliar with that process or that theory or approach, we'll talk about that. We'll also show how it granted some students feelings of autonomy. They were able to personalize their language learning research topics, and we as teachers were able to kind of focus on our language teaching questions that we had. And we also experienced teacher-student collaboration in the project, and we'll talk about some of the benefits or some of the limitations of that. And finally, reflect on what went well, what didn't go so well, and suggestions for future iterations of exploratory practice in any language learning classrooms. So let's explain how this project began. We worked with Dr. Ann Burns, as well as some of our colleagues doing joint action research projects. And in the initial stages, while we were considering action research and looking at different literature and talking to different people, our interests migrated into exploratory practice. And that's mostly because we were looking at ways, different ways and new ways for students to engage with academic research, to better contextualize the classroom research process that they were expected to participate in both their writing classes, such as academic writing genres like essays, research papers, but also when teachers would come in and say, hey, can you please do this questionnaire? Or, hey, can you please answer some questions in an interview with me, to kind of demystify the research process for them. So after we conducted the literature review that Kevin highlighted, we piloted this course in a first-year Japanese reading and writing course, so it was all freshmen. This course traditionally follows a genre approach. So what a genre approach to reading and writing looks like is that students engage with different genres of writing, different styles of writing. Some examples include procedural texts. So students will read and write a variety of instructions or directions or recipes. Narrative texts, so they'll practice fictional writing as well as a personal narrative. Information reports, they'll conduct secondary research and have to summarize and paraphrase the information they found in poster presentations or slideshows. So those are the genres that they traditionally engage with. But based on my research into genre approaches, one limitation is if it's decontextualized, it's really hard for students to kind of understand why they're learning all these conventions, all these different genre conventions. They're just kind of going through the motions and it may not stick with them. And for teachers who are new to a genre approach, they may tend to focus too much on the conventions in terms of assessing student success. They may say, hey, a recipe has A, B, C, and D, and you didn't hit all those points. So there may be too much focus on those conventions and not enough leeway or understanding of how conventions adapt to change or to different cultural environments and so on. So we hoped that the exploratory practice would contextualize those genres, that if students could investigate their own language learning inquiries and then conduct the research and express the results of the research using these genres, that way it would be contextualized, personalized, and meaningful. And also, I think a benefit of conducting this course was helping students learn autonomy. That is a big goal of Conda University with the Self-Access Learning Center is student autonomy, and through offering them personalized topics and finally, as mentioned before, working with students, kind of co-research, that opportunity arose as well. So that's an overview of the project. As for how we conducted this project, some of the methodology, it's first of all important to note that this was done during emergency mandatory online teaching. So we used Zoom and other learning management systems like Google Classroom. We initially thought this might be a hang-up, that we may not be able to do the project if it was going to switch from face-to-face to online, but we found it was still successful online. It was, we were able to adapt the materials accordingly. And this was done in the second semester, so students had already acclimated to our environment and to online learning. They knew each other well, they knew me well. We met 4 times a week in 90-minute sessions. So we did have a pretty intensive schedule, and we had enough time. We had a flexible schedule in terms of slowing down the pace if things were too difficult, or granting a little bit more time if students needed on their project, and so on. As for the content of this course, as mentioned a few times, one of the purposes of EP is investigating language learning puzzles. So students were given the opportunity to research their own language learning questions. And the results of those questions were produced in the different genres. And hopefully the following slides will make that a little bit more concrete for you. As for Kevin and me, we analyzed those genre reports, the projects that the students produced. We took a look at those. And we also looked at their reflective writing. So students also wrote journal entries and a final reflective essay about exploratory practice. How was it for them? Did they understand it? How did they feel about it? And so on. We had 2 main points in doing this project. One was to give students the chance to explore their own puzzles. Again, one of the main tenets is that students are co-researchers. So they're not our guinea pigs, as it were. They are kind of equal research partners with us. So we granted them the chance to conduct their own research puzzles, and we were able to also analyze those puzzles. And we as teachers observed how exploratory practice changed the classroom dynamics or affected the classroom. And we also used exploratory practice to consider quality of life in the classroom. So it may still seem rather abstract. What is exploratory practice and what does it look like in the classroom? I think if we look at the actual student puzzles on the next slides, that may help you see kind of the first steps that students take in such a project. And we also had our own research questions. Our first question was, what effect does this approach have on the learning outcomes, right? So we did have kind of set learning objectives set by the department, for this genre-based reading and writing course, right? They had to be able to produce certain genres. They had to be able to use certain reading skills and certain writing skills. Number two, what effect does it have on students' engagement with the course materials? Right? Did they completely disconnect from this? Were they really engaged and motivated? And number three, what did the students report learning about their own individual topics? We were curious to see, after the students conducted their research into their language learning, what did they find? So let's take a look at some examples of student research puzzles. And before I show you some of these, building up to this point, we had a few weeks of class to kind of reacclimate to the environment and also start to introduce what is exploratory practice. So we provided kind of simplified literature. We had some activities where students could think about, what questions do you have about language learning, or, what is research even? Just kind of meta awareness of that process. We developed that first. And then they were given the task of developing individual puzzles, basically what questions or inquiries did they have about language learning. And these are results from the students. These are puzzles that the students themselves came up with models, but not with any kind of teacher guidance. This is from their own autonomy. So a lot of questions about the inability to speak English, comparing themselves to native speakers or to other cultures. Questions about pronunciation, how to memorize vocabulary or how to remember vocabulary. Again, kind of comparing themselves to L1 speakers. And some students were interested in opportunities to speak English out of the class. So students did think about quality of life in the classroom, right? What's different from in the classroom and out of the classroom. So those were some individual language learning puzzles. And from those puzzles, we found common themes or common threads, and we did an initial genre project in groups. So students were able to work with partners. And these were the 7 group topics. So some themes emerged about vocabulary. And you can see some interesting topics. These, again, students self-selected these, like how to learn polysemous words, how to keep up a conversation, have more opportunities to speak English, remembering vocabulary, and so on. So with those puzzles, students then conducted research kind of following the genres of an information report. They conducted primary research by interviewing classmates, interviewing teachers. Some of them conducted secondary research looking at literature. And once they produced those projects, we looked at those projects to consider the success of exploratory practice. And just a reminder, or just to recap, one of the tenets of exploratory practice is not to overburden the teacher or the students with too much additional research methodology. So we tried to do this using existing classroom practices. In this case, students were already familiar with writing journals, reflective writing. So we looked at student fluency writing and the final results of each genre project. In this case, they did jointly constructed information reports, resulting in slideshow presentations about their answers. They wrote their own research essays. And finally, at the end of the class, they wrote reflective essays. So using existing classroom practices, we were able to analyze that, the results, and decide the effect or the impact that exploratory practice had on the class. And we did so by looking at their student journals, which were in response to specific exploratory practice prompts. So we would have a journal topic such as Do you feel like you understand what exploratory practice is? Or how is your research project coming along? How do you feel working with partners? You know, are there good and bad points about working with partners? We also qualitatively analyzed their final projects. So we looked at the results of the project to see if they both met the course objectives and also understood how to conduct these research projects based on their own topics. Okay, so that is kind of a summary or an overview of what we did in the class. So just to recap, using genres such as information reports and research essays, students self-selected their own language learning puzzles, questions they had or interests that they had about learning English. They did those projects, and then we looked at the results. And I'll turn it over to Kevin so that he can discuss those results.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So from looking at those data points, the work that students were doing, 3 themes emerged. The first one was about students' understanding. Did they seem to understand EP at all? Did they get it? The second point was their feelings towards it. So maybe they understood it or not. How do they feel about their own? Did they feel comfortable with it? And finally, their generative, creative, or novel ideas. Were they coming up with additional questions? Were they going further? Was something coming out of this process? We want to share some excerpts here to give an idea of what we were looking at and how these themes emerged. So reading here, the first excerpt, as for future EP projects, this is the student writing, I would like to know about the English education style in other countries where people speak English as a second language. However, in my solo project, I would like to ask teachers who are from countries where people speak English as a second language some questions about their country's English learning style. So they're thinking about a new way for their own project to focus on a specific population, the teachers themselves. And they end with this thought, I hope the next freshman students see our reports and follow our topic next year. So from work like this, we saw new ideas for future projects. They want to specify who they're interviewing, mixed with additional research questions. And they're also interested in this process continuing. They would like to see their project pass on, like pass the torch to the next freshman students. Excerpt 2 here. The student writes, after reflecting, I realized that we can think about the topic deeply from various perspectives by sharing ideas, and group work is one of the most effective ways. Now, of course, this is a common theme of a lot of work in conversation or communication courses. What we want to highlight is EP doesn't consider problems and solutions. Rather, it considers a puzzle and kind of perspectives. And the student is sort of writing here, what we saw was, yeah, they're kind of understanding they're not going to find the answer, you know, the exact ABC answer to their question. What they are going to find are different ideas and perspectives on this. They also write, for future EP, I would like to do information search more. However, I would like to adopt open-ended questions because I couldn't do it this time. So they're talking about the value of group work. They're also saying some self-criticism. They want to have open-ended questions. So if you consider the genre of like an information report about a research process, the student is recognizing that there's some value in how you design your survey. A teacher could tell the student, hey, you should make open-ended questions, it's better. And the student says, oh, okay, and tries to do it. But maybe they fail at it. Or maybe they say, okay, I'll do it because the teacher told me to do it. In this process, the student ran up against that limitation themselves. And they reflected, I want to use open-ended because I couldn't do it. And I can see now that it's better. It would have given me better answers. Excerpt 3, the student writes, I would like to find out why Japanese people can't speak English well as English learners in other countries. It's a very valid question, very fair question. However, I want to focus on more accurate questions for the next EP project because we made too many questions for the group EP project. So there's a specific focus for this imagined future project, and there's this self-criticism on the scope and the ambition. This isn't the teacher pulling a rubric down and saying, you had too many questions, -5 points. This is the student saying, we overdid it, we overcooked it. We've got too many questions. And they realized by the end of it that they could have focused those questions more. So in terms of teaching the genre of making a questionnaire, making an information report, instead of saying, these are the genre conventions, we use them because we use them, the students are realizing, oh, those are the conventions because those are the most logical. Those focus your writing and those focus your questions. I think the final excerpt we have here 4, this student writes about there's efficiency and possibility in the project. And in group work, they say we were able to make up for each other's weak points in this project. So a very strong point there for the group work again. There's some awareness that I couldn't have being alone. So working together, they really valued that. They said the skills are limited that I can improve in solo projects. With that in mind, in the group EP project in class, I think that I can get more than just a puzzle's answer. So they're reiterating again that group work is valuable. They're also talking about more than just a puzzle's answer. And that's kind of the whole thing. Because if you think of a problem and an answer, you've got a straight path. But they're understanding that a puzzle doesn't just have this answer, it has this environmental context. And they're starting to understand, like, there's more than that. There's more, and it's interesting because they've designed the questions. So summarizing there from what I took from the excerpts, sorry, it's moving a little slow. Okay, so research question 1, we talked about the effect of EP on the learning outcomes. They use the conventions for concrete learning purposes that they defined for themselves. And many of them expressed a desire to continue this process in future courses. A lot of them got really excited when they realized that the brakes were off, that they really could go and pursue something on their own, and they would be getting support the whole time. So we said it had a positive effect on the outcomes, definitely a positive effect. Research question 2, we asked about the learning outcomes, the student engagement, so their interest level. Well, definitely engaged. Students personalized their topics and pursued them out of their own interest, often going beyond their initial topic to discover related and more complex subtopics. So this was all part of the coursework they were doing in groups, and many of them kept going sort of beyond the initial questions that were being asked. The final research question highlighted a potential weak point of exploratory practice, and maybe not exactly a criticism, but let's say a weak point. What did students report learning about their topic? It seemed most students learned valuable but limited information about the topic itself. So how to learn vocabulary, how to learn pronunciation, mostly due to the unfolding complexity of their questions as they pursued their topic with greater depth in research. I think when you know a little bit, you start to know more and more. The more you know, the more you realize that you don't know, because you step into this wider world. Without putting barriers and structure around the research projects, students were free to go out and find more information. They were motivated. But as they got into it, they realized just how much information they were encountering. And they realized they had to use the genres to structure that information. Otherwise, it would be just too complex. The EP approach illustrated how students might experiment with and improve upon research methods for use in future advanced coursework. Many of them said, I want to use this again. I want to use this again. This is hard, but I want to use this in more courses because it's a good way to approach writing and expressing myself in academic English. So discussion. So advantages. They learned about puzzles that were immediately relevant to their experiences. They went beyond their initial topic. And the results suggest new directions. So as Matthew and I were talking about this course, I would often ask him, how is this? How is that? What can be done better? And we got a lot of ideas for how to move forward with this sort of approach, including a research community Matthew will talk about a bit. So those are some advantages. Drawbacks. Ultimately, students are not researchers, so they may be unsatisfied with the unfolding complexity. as they go down the line and get into their topics more and more, it can be very difficult. Practicing research skills alongside language skills can be overwhelming. They're doing a lot of things at once here. They're juggling academic English, they're juggling good ethical research skills, citation skills, along with language skills the whole time. And finally, student work is going to come out really differently. Each group has a different puzzle and a different pace. So it could be hard to assess that. You don't have a set rubric for how to judge. And you're not saying, well, did you find your answer? Because they're not looking for an answer. We are assessing the genre writing and the success by which they fulfilled the genre, but it's going to look very different. I'm going to pass off to Matthew now for some conclusions and future directions.
Thanks, Kevin. So I was the teacher of the exploratory practice pilot in the classroom. And based on my experiences and based on analyzing student reflections of their experiences and based on my discussions with Kevin, first of all, we do think that exploratory practice is a good way to contextualize genre reading and writing. So if you have this style of reading and writing approach in the class you're teaching, and you're wondering how can you contextualize it, right? If you feel like all of these genres are just taught in isolation, adapting exploratory practice and letting students take the helm, as it were, it is a good way to make it a more cohesive and coherent reading and writing class. And all of the students completed the course objectives satisfactorily in terms of the department expectations for them to master certain grammatical convention, or grammar and genre conventions. All of the students did so. You know, some more successful than others, of course, but we felt that it gave the chance for students to pursue and define and refine their own topics by using this writing cycle, right? Using research, discussing with their partners and teacher, writing the genre, whether it be an information report or a research essay or whatnot, and then of course revising after teacher feedback, after peer feedback. So it was kind of the best of both worlds in that students learn these writing conventions, you know, practice good academic writing, but also were able to engage with their own learning goals, their own personalized learning goals. There are challenges if anybody is interested in adapting an exploratory practice approach. First of all, as mentioned earlier, and based on all of our literature review, depending on the approach or the scale of exploratory practice you want to adapt, you may need to relinquish that idea of teacher as authority figure and adapt a more collaborative role. But that's not a bad thing based on not only the literature review that we conducted, but also on our own experience. In this class with 21 students, all of the students responded positively to that shift, right? Instead of me being the taskmaster and you know, rapping knuckles and so on, you know, students rose to the challenge when granted autonomy, when given the chance to research things that were interesting to them. It was refreshing to join a breakout room on Zoom and listen to them working independently, right? They got started, they assigned each other roles, they were using English to conduct their research. It didn't require a lot of teacher intervention in terms of kind of forcing the flow. It did require teacher involvement in terms of, again, as collaborator. I was involved with the students, always there available to provide guidance and assistance and reminders. But it was, I think, a positive experience. I hope that answered an earlier question about that. It may be difficult for teachers who have pretty strict or rigid course requirements or course outcomes because EP is pretty open-ended. It is a leap of faith to grant such freedom to your students. to maybe have a big paradigm shift within your own classroom, kind of upend maybe what your routine has been. So that, yeah, that is a potential challenge. It may not appeal to in some cases, but I would counter with the fact that, as we saw in our case studies, exploratory practice is fluid. You can adopt a soft approach to exploratory practice. You could, as one of the case studies we looked at showed, it could be as simple as just having a poll, like, hey, students, would you rather do A or B, right? And respecting the decision that they come up with, right? Would you rather write a free topic journal today, or would you rather your teacher choose the journal topic? Just little steps like that, where students feel that you're respecting their decision-making skills, you respect their choice. That is a form of exploratory practice, kind of a softer approach. Finally, in our case, we teach in what's called the IC department, the International Communications Department. I think someone asked what the majors were of these students. They are all international communications majors. And the understanding is that they're interested in foreign cultures, they're interested in international issues. Most of them want to study abroad, but many of them have studied abroad. Another point of our students is that they were operating at different levels. We teach a mixed tier class. So we had students who were returnees. We have students who are half Japanese and half British, who speak fluent English and read native level novels. But we had students who are coming in at much lower operating levels in terms of English fluency. So we did have to navigate that issue. We did have to think about mixing groups so that everyone could have maybe kind of a mentor member, right, who's there to explain something that other students maybe couldn't understand in a handout, or express what they wanted to say in their essay with a bit more fluency. But we did have to also keep that in mind in terms of assessing their ability.
Sorry,
And,
Matthew, we might want to wrap up soon.
Yeah, just a few minutes. So those were some of the challenges of that. We're hoping that because we've primed the pump by creating these materials, that it'll be self-sustaining and open up future opportunities, for example, student research journals. Here's some references we talked about. If you want to look into other literature, Dick Allwright's one of the big authors on that. And those were the case studies, Hanks and Pinter. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, if there are any questions, I think maybe a minute or so, we'll try to answer some questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, presenters. Audience, please unmute your microphones, and maybe now we can give the presenters a round of applause. Thank you very much. So right now I'm going to stop recording this presentation.